Welcome to Serial Killer Files by Skoob, and I am your host, Arthur Morgan, and today we are going back to spring break, 1989, Matamoros, Mexico. While thousands of American college students flooded across the border for a week of parties and celebrations, 21-year-old Mark Kilroy from the University of Texas was simply looking for a good time with his friends. But on the night of March 14th, as he walked near a nightclub in the border city, Mark vanished into the darkness. What happened next would expose one of the most disturbing criminal cults in modern history. A terrifying fusion of ancient religious practices, brutal drug cartels, and human sacrifice that would shock two nations and reveal a monster who believed murder could grant supernatural powers. This is the story of Adolfo Constanzo, the Narcosatanist cult leader whose reign of terror left at least 23 victims buried in shallow graves, their bodies mutilated for dark rituals that promised invisibility, invincibility, and protection from the law. To understand the horror that unfolded at Rancho Santa Elena, we need to go back to 1962 to Miami, Florida, where Adolfo Constanzo was born to a teenage Cuban immigrant mother named Delia Gonzalez. From his very first breath, Constanzo was immersed in a world that straddled two realities, the visible and the invisible, the sacred and the profane. His mother was a practitioner of Palo Mayombe, an Afro-Cuban religion that blends spiritualism, ancestor veneration, and the use of a magical cauldron called nganga. Imagine growing up in a home where spiritual rituals were as common as breakfast, where the boundaries between this world and the spirit world were paper-thin. Young Adolfo didn't just learn about these practices, he lived them, breathed them, absorbed them into his very being. But here's where it gets fascinating and deeply disturbing. Constanzo wasn't raised in just one spiritual tradition. He served as an altar boy in the Catholic Church, attending Mass, learning prayers, going through all the rituals of mainstream Christianity. By day, he was the picture of religious devotion in its most acceptable form. By night, he learned his mother's occult rituals. This dual spiritual upbringing created something unique and dangerous, a mind that could seamlessly blend different belief systems, that understood the power of ritual and symbolism from multiple angles. From a young age, Constanzo showed an unsettling interest in the darker aspects of spirituality. While other children played with toys, he was fascinated by magic, violence, and control. Unlike those who explore occult traditions for spiritual enlightenment or cultural connection, Constanzo was drawn to power, raw, dominating, terrifying power. His approach to spirituality wasn't about finding peace or understanding. It was about bending others to his will, about commanding fear and loyalty through supernatural means. By the early 1980s, Constanzo had relocated to Mexico City, and this is where his transformation from troubled young man to cult leader began. The city, with its complex underworld of criminals, corrupt officials, and desperate people seeking any advantage, was the perfect breeding ground for someone with Constanzo's particular talents. He began attracting followers almost immediately. His first disciples included Martin Quintana and Omar Orea, men who would become part of his inner circle. But Constanzo wasn't just building a religious following. He was constructing something far more calculating and sinister, a criminal empire cloaked in occult mysticism. What made Constanzo so dangerous was his charisma. Those who met him described a magnetic personality, someone who could read people, understand their fears and desires, and offer them exactly what they needed to hear. He positioned himself as a psychic and spiritual advisor, offering ritual cleansings, fortune-telling, and magical protection spells. These weren't services marketed to everyday people looking for spiritual guidance. No, Constanzo targeted a very specific clientele: drug dealers, cartel hitmen, corrupt police officers, politicians, and other members of Mexico's criminal underworld. Think about the psychology here. These were men who lived constantly with the threat of death, from rivals, from law enforcement, from betrayal within their own organizations. They were powerful, yes, but also deeply paranoid and superstitious. When Constanzo promised them supernatural protection, when he claimed his magic could make them bulletproof or invisible to the police, he was offering them something money couldn't buy: certainty in an uncertain world, protection that went beyond bulletproof vests and armed guards. His followers began calling him El Padrino, the Godfather. It was a title that captured both his criminal connections and his spiritual authority. And as his reputation grew, so did his ambitions. He wasn't content with performing rituals for others. He wanted to build something bigger, something that would cement his power in both the spiritual and criminal worlds. Constanzo's spiritual system was a terrifying hybrid. He took traditional Palo Mayombe practices and twisted them, adding elements from Santeria and other African diaspora religions, then incorporating his own dark innovations. At the center of it all was the nganga, the magical cauldron that, in traditional practice, contained sacred objects, herbs, and the remains of the dead to house ancestral spirits. But Constanzo believed that traditional methods weren't powerful enough. He started by raiding graveyards, digging up human bones to place in his nganga. These weren't just any bones. He claimed the spirits needed fresh energy, not the dried remains of the long dead. The escalation was gradual but inevitable. Animal sacrifices came first: goats, snakes, even exotic zoo animals. But in Constanzo's twisted theology, these weren't enough. He needed living sacrifices. Human sacrifices. This is where Constanzo's practical criminal mind merged perfectly with his spiritual beliefs. He settled at Rancho Santa Elena, a remote desert property on the outskirts of Matamoros, Tamaulipas. This wasn't random. Matamoros sat right on the Texas-Mexico border, a crucial corridor for drug trafficking. The location allowed Constanzo to embed his cult directly into cartel operations. The promise he made to his criminal clients was simple but powerful: participate in the rituals, provide offerings to the nganga, and you'll receive supernatural protection for your drug shipments. You'll become invisible to Border Patrol. Bullets won't touch you. The law can't catch you. It was around this time that Sarah Aldrete entered the picture. She would become La Madrina, the godmother, Constanzo's lieutenant and high priestess. Together, they recruited others into the cult, and Aldrete's methods were as disturbing as you'd expect. She reportedly showed potential recruits horror films as a form of initiation, desensitizing them to violence, preparing them for what they would witness and participate in. Under their leadership, the cult began its descent into true horror. Victims were abducted from Matamoros and surrounding areas. They were chosen carefully, sometimes from vulnerable populations like the homeless and sex workers, sometimes rival criminals, and later individuals Constanzo believed possessed particularly powerful life force. Constanzo's modus operandi was methodical, ritualized, and utterly brutal. Each murder followed a pattern, a religious framework that gave purpose and meaning to the violence, at least in Constanzo's mind. Victims were brought to Rancho Santa Elena, where the cult's shrine and ritual shed awaited. The ceremonies that followed combined torture, mutilation, and sacrifice. Execution methods typically involved machete strikes to the head or neck, carried out while cult members chanted and performed ritual gestures meant to summon spiritual power. But the killing itself was only part of the ritual. Constanzo believed that the more suffering inflicted, the more potent the magical energy released. This wasn't just sadism, though it certainly was sadistic. It was rooted in a twisted spiritual logic. Pain amplified power. Terror strengthened protection. Death, when conducted properly, transferred the victim's life force directly into the nganga. The removal of organs was highly ritualized. The brain was considered especially valuable for providing psychic power. Spinal columns were wired before burial, allowing for later retrieval of bones without disturbing the grave significantly. Hearts, other organs, and body parts were all carefully harvested and placed in the nganga, along with blood, animal parts, and personal effects. Constanzo ensured that his followers were deeply involved in the killings. This served multiple purposes. First, it bound them to him through complicity. Once you've participated in murder, there's no walking away. Second, it reinforced the group's isolation from normal society. Third, it created a culture of absolute obedience. Witnesses to these rituals understood implicitly, this could happen to you if you betray us. The bodies were buried in shallow graves on the ranch, often mixed with animal remains to confuse investigators. The cult had claimed at least 14 victims before Mark Kilroy's abduction, and authorities believed there may have been more. But the crimes remained hidden, protected by the cult's connection to the drug trade, by the fear they instilled, and by the sheer remoteness of their operations. March 1989. As college students poured into Matamoros for spring break, Constanzo's drug trafficking clients made a demand. They were planning a major drug shipment and needed strong medicine, a human sacrifice that would ensure success and grant them invisibility from American Border Patrol agents. Constanzo's response was chilling in its randomness. They would grab someone off the street, someone whose disappearance would provide the powerful energy they needed. They didn't know they were about to make a fatal mistake, one that would bring the full weight of international law enforcement down upon them. Mark Kilroy was 21 years old, a pre-med student at the University of Texas, with his whole life ahead of him. On the night of March 14, 1989, he was walking near a nightclub with friends when members of Constanzo's inner circle, including Sar Aldrate, spotted him. What made Mark appealing as a sacrifice? Perhaps his youth, his vitality, the fact that he was clearly a college student, someone with education, with promise. Constanzo believed that the brain held special power, and he wanted someone intelligent, someone whose mind could transfer maximum psychic energy to the nganga. Mark was abducted right off the street, likely lured or forced into a vehicle, and driven to Rancho Santa Elena. His friends searched frantically for him. His parents flew down from Texas. The disappearance of an American citizen triggered immediate international attention, exactly the kind of scrutiny that Constanzo's operation had successfully avoided until now. Though Constanzo wasn't present during the actual abduction, he orchestrated everything that followed. At the ranch, Mark was held captive, tortured, and subjected to the full horror of Constanzo's ritual murder process. The cult believed his body parts and blood would give them unprecedented supernatural power. The brutality was extreme, even by the cult's standards. Mark's brain was excised, the key ingredient Constanzo wanted for the nganga. The torture and mutilation that preceded his death were designed to amplify the magical effect of the sacrifice. This wasn't just murder. It was spiritual cannibalism, an attempt to consume Mark's very essence and convert it into protection and power. After the ritual, Mark's mutilated remains were buried in a shallow grave alongside 14 other victims who had died before him. The mass grave near the cult's shrine became a repository of horror, a physical manifestation of Constanzo's twisted theology. The discovery that would unravel everything came not from the Mark Kilroy investigation directly, but from a routine traffic stop. A cult member named David Cerna ran a police roadblock. His erratic behavior and the discovery of marijuana in his vehicle gave police probable cause to investigate further. When authorities began questioning Cerna about activities at Rancho Santa Elena, something broke inside him. The psychological pressure of maintaining the cult's secrets, the trauma of what he'd witnessed and participated in, it all came pouring out. He confessed to the ritual murders and revealed the existence of the mass grave. On April 11, 1989, Mexican authorities descended on Rancho Santa Elena. What they found defied belief. 15 mutilated bodies buried in a pit. The nganga, with its grotesque contents of human remains, blood, and ritual objects. The shed where the killings took place, still bearing evidence of recent violence. Dental records confirmed that one of the victims was Mark Kilroy. The discovery unleashed a media firestorm. The term Narcosatanists was coined to describe the cult, a perfect encapsulation of the merger between drug trafficking and occult murder. Both the American and Mexican governments came under intense pressure to capture Constanzo and his followers. The manhunt became one of the most intense cross-border operations in history. Constanzo fled north to Mexico City with his inner circle, including Martin Quintana and Sara Aldrete. They took refuge in a small apartment in the Cuauhtemoc neighborhood, hoping to disappear into the capital's anonymity. For nearly a month they evaded capture. But on May 6, 1989, fate intervened in the most mundane way possible. Police were called to Constanzo's apartment building over a noise complaint or dispute that had nothing to do with the cult. Pure coincidence. But when Constanzo saw police approaching, he panicked. Believing they'd been found, he opened fire with a machine gun, instantly revealing his position and bringing massive police mobilization to the scene. Trapped in knowing capture was inevitable, Constanzo made his final play, one that demonstrated the absolute control he still held over his followers. He refused to be taken alive. Prison, for a man who'd styled himself as an all-powerful sorcerer, would be the ultimate humiliation. So he handed the machine gun to one of his most devoted followers, Alvaro de Leon Valdez, known as El Dubi, and gave an order that few people would ever comply with. "Kill me." The follower obeyed. He shot both Constanzo and Martin Quintana, riddling them with bullets in a final act of twisted loyalty. By the time police stormed the apartment, Adolfo Constanzo was dead at age 26. The man who'd claimed to possess supernatural power, who'd murdered at least 23 people in pursuit of magical invincibility, died in a hail of bullets fired by his own disciple. Sara Aldrete and the remaining cult members were arrested at the scene. They would face trial for their roles in the ritual killings, and many would spend decades in prison. The story of Adolfo Constanzo forces us to confront a disturbing truth: how easily belief can be twisted into a weapon. He wasn't just a criminal. He was a master manipulator who fused ritual, fear, and violence to control lives. Mark Kilroy and many others weren't random victims. They were consumed by a belief system where human life was expendable in the pursuit of power. When the Narcosatanist cult collapsed, the damage didn't disappear. Families were shattered, borders were shaken, and survivors were left carrying memories that defy explanation. Constanzo claimed supernatural protection, yet when the walls closed in, his magic failed him. His followers couldn't save him. The forces he worshipped stayed silent. But here's the question that lingers. How did so many intelligent people fall under his control? And could something like this happen again? To uncover the deeper psychology, the hidden rituals, and the moments that led to his final downfall, download the Skoob app now and listen to the full story. Some truths are too disturbing to ignore, and too important not to understand. Is this conversation helpful so far?